Our next speaker is Michael Embesi, and he's with the City of Austin Planning and Development Review Department. He is the city arborist, so he deals with the heritage tree issues, and he also, they have some new urban foresters in their department that he oversees as well. So like I said, I put everybody's bios on the agenda because I had a tendency in the past to go on and on about people's experience, but I think our time's better spent talking about the subject and why we're here. So please help me welcome Mr. Michael Embesi.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Denise, and thank you for being here today. It's an honor to speak with you. Would you give me a 5-minute signal if I start rambling on? We got 45 minutes to talk about regulations today. We're going to spend 45 minutes on regulations, and I'll do my best not to ramble and make it exciting. You're here there's a spot this morning that we get to recognize trees and their importance to our city. And we do that in many ways, and regulations is just one of those. And being the city arborist, it's an opportunity to have a very unique system, as we have in Austin, to recognize our trees and to protect them. So thank you for being here. I have a little test at the end of my presentation, as any teacher has taught you, to make sure we pass along the information that we've learned. And it seems like we have 10 seats behind us. It's a little strange talking this direction at council. So if there's any acting up, these may be our timeout seats for any of our audience members. So be on your best behavior. Again, my name's Michael Embesi, and I'm here to talk about trees. Before we get into regulations, we want to talk about the benefits of trees. It's really just a reminder of how important trees are to all of us. Much of that importance is innate. We just know trees are important. We are taught it in school. That trees clean our air. They're the lungs of our city. That trees clean our water as it infiltrates through the soil. They're nature's water treatment plant. They provide a service to those that are around them by providing those types of services, much less, as I've listed here, wildlife services or screening services, benefits, adding property value, and, of course, the aesthetic value that comes along with all trees. The aesthetic value is, I'd be remiss not to mention it. It works in special ways. We're finding that trees are providing value by their aesthetics, by simply making it a more pleasurable drive to work because you have a tree-lined street. We're finding by studies that have been performed that workers are more efficient. They're happier. They work harder if they're not as stressed. And trees help reduce that stress, those incremental stressors that we have. So once we arrive to work, if we all had to sit in a little bit of traffic, but if trees are present, maybe it's a little more tolerable. We are also finding that school kids are scoring higher if they have a view of nature, as opposed to having hard walls. If they can see a tree, it creates an environment that they're more willing to learn or participate. If we go to a park, we're naturally inclined to get close to a tree to have our picnic because of some type of aesthetic benefit that these trees are providing. And so this is really the basis of why trees are so important to us. They have multiple benefits throughout our community. A little history. Nearly 30 years ago, the city of Austin passed a tree ordinance that recognized all those benefits. It was one of the first communities in the nation to draft an ordinance that protects trees. Not an ordinance that says you have to replace trees if you remove them. Not an ordinance that just protects our trees and our parks. It's an ordinance that recognizes the value of trees throughout our community, in our public spaces, in our backyards, along our streets. And it identified specifically that our large trees are doing the lion's share of these benefits that they're providing to all of our citizens. They're shading our homes. They're creating additional property value. And a large tree itself at the time, and we still have it in place today, is considered a tree with a trunk that's 60 inches around. That's a tree that you could barely put your arms around. It's fairly simple, as all ordinances. I think the more simple they are, the more transferable they are, the more applicable they are, the more understandable they are. And so it just basically leaves it at that. Once a tree reaches that size, it's protected. And so you would need a permit to disturb the root system or to remove it. And we'll get into that quite a bit throughout this presentation. But roughly since then, since 1983, we've had very few changes to the tree ordinance. We've had some initiatives that have dealt with tree-related issues, urban heat island, landscaping issues, climate change. Had different boards and commissions that have weighed in on how important trees are to the community. And we've had 2 tree summits. The first one was in 2009, where we got together with individuals like yourself, where we talked about the challenges that we're faced in a community that elevates the value and recognizes the legitimate value of trees within our community. Most recently, we've raised the bar on our protected tree ordinance, and we have a heritage tree ordinance now. In 2010, just a few years ago, the City Council passed unanimously that there is a heritage tree ordinance now that insists that these trees are incorporated within the design and part of our community from generation to generation, because they're native trees, they're long-lived trees, and the services that those very large trees are providing are so much higher than our smaller trees. Some of the challenges that we have as an entity, as a municipality, as an organization, the City of Austin, civil servants, we have multiple programs within the city. We've got multiple departments within the city with even more programs than each of those departments. This is an example. This was created many years ago of roughly 10 different departments, roughly 30 different programs on the screen that all have the ability to impact the urban forest. Trees within those programs, whether they're planting trees, touching trees, pruning trees, removing trees, working near trees. And it's very important that we have a coordinated and consistent basis. So this is just one example of showing that it's not just one entity or one person or one department that has the ability to promote the importance of trees and protecting trees within our community. Stole my thunder there. The premise behind really the stability, the piers that hold up the tree ordinance are all based on public health. They're based on public health. Of course, I'll go straight to what we just talked about, public health, meaning that trees are providing a substantial benefit to our citizens. From what we discussed earlier, the welfare of citizens, whether it's health, mental health, physical health, air quality. However, all trees are not perfect. So on the other side of protecting the public, we also have to assess when trees begin to fail or begin to decline or die or they're dead. At one point in a tree's life, its value is going to be outweighed by the risk that that tree provides. And as arborists, we assess those risks daily to determine which trees need to be removed, because the risk that that dying tree weighs is very high, potentially, of where it's at. Whether it's in a park setting near a swing or if it's over the right-of-way and cars are parked there, at one point in time, the health and the structure of that tree will be at the point where it will need to be removed to protect the public welfare. And of course, that's a constant daily assessment that we make. Whether it's development sites or whether it's in our public lands, we're constantly looking at the conservation of this valuable resource throughout our community. Honing in now on our development regulations is that our urban forest is, all of our trees are referred to as our urban forest, Austin's urban forest. It is a component. It's not the forest we learned about when we were in school or the forest that we go camping in with our families. It's the forest that we live in. This urban forest has multiple benefits. However, it comes with many challenges of living so closely with trees. These trees evolved in a forest, a community that people were not part of. And gradually, we learned that trees were valuable for various reasons, and now we live amongst them. We plant them. We incorporate them in our homes. And so that is a pretty substantial difference to those impacts that have historically made an impact on trees. For example, this is just a simple depiction of the natural things that occur to a tree, whether it be disease or fire or poor weather or harsh weather. Those really pale in comparison to the impacts that we have with trees with development. And as a side note, from a development standpoint, I'm not really just talking about the large development that we see on a busy street corner. We all live in homes that have been developed. We maintain our homes and our driveways and our utility lines. All of those things are in the development arena that impact trees. So the presentation today is really to bring light on that many things that we do have an impact to trees because it's within our urban forest and the challenges that trees have existing and coexisting with us in this area. This was a forested area in South Austin. It was a forested area. It was about nearly 8 years ago, and it's a depiction of the requirements that we have of living close together, having big homes, having those driveways and utility lines and roads that we need to function effectively. And this is just a reality that we have when we move into a forested area. This is the same area, just it's a pretty standard example when we have new subdivisions. It's likely an example that occurred in our old subdivisions when they were built. And we were able to save very few trees here. And that's a comment I make to myself as well. I could have done a better job preserving more trees here. But the photograph just depicts the very challenging effort that is needed to incorporate trees and all the necessities that we have during development. We have all different types of development, and single-family homes is some of the more kinder types of development because we can manipulate the house and the driveways and things of that nature. But it's still very challenged to minimize impacts to trees when we go from a heavily forested area such as this to day one of the development, which is this. So, from a development review perspective, we typically look at new homes, remodels, additions, really anything that may need a building permit. We have a process in place to make sure we can preserve those large trees where feasible. This can be done simply by moving a unit or a house one direction or another. It has been done by redesigning the home to capture the value that the trees on the property have. And in most cases, it's been a very good working relationship with the home building community. And in most cases, it's a discussion. It's an opportunity to exchange the values that both we're required to do as tree preservers and the home builder has as a home builder, to make sure that we have an agreement, kind of a union for as a plan goes, to make sure that we're meeting all those goals for the property. And as the process progresses, as we issue that permit, as the home builder protects that tree during construction, and as they turn over the keys to the new owner, it's very rewarding to see the new owner and the builder so thankful that the trees were incorporated. It's a little extra work, but as of day one of this home, this home would have 3 significant homes, and it's going to feel lived in, and it's going to provide all those benefits that trees provide to this new family. In general, trees have been pretty happy lately. We've been on a cycle of this 3-week rainfall event. I'm very thankful that from a vegetation standpoint, it's been very helpful, especially since the drought that we had just a few years ago. We lost a lot of trees due to the drought. Trees decline very slowly. Usually one thing is not the nail in the coffin for a tree. Trees have acclimated to their urban environment. They become stressed from either drought or disturbance in their root systems. And because they're not all perfect, we have to look at all the different variables that are associated with assessing whether trees are to be preserved or should they be removed and replaced with younger trees. And this is just a list of items that we look at when it comes to the assessment of each and individual protected size tree. We've got about 100 different species in Austin. Most of those are native. We also look at the location of the tree on the lot, whether it's a large lot, a small lot, the type of development that's slated for this parcel. Makes a pretty big difference. Trees. There's a saying in the arborist community that trees can't run, but we have the ability now to actually transplant large trees when it's feasible to do so. And of course, we only transplant our most valuable trees when they can't be worked around. Obviously, we look at the health, but we also look at the form or the structure of a tree. When assessing the tree, it's not just, it could be a healthy tree, but structurally there could be problems. I guess a different way of looking at it is, what's the architecture of the tree? Is there a lot of competition in one location of the trunk where there's many branches that are coming out? That is going to be a long-term problem, whereas those branches get larger, they're going to encroach on their growing zones, and we'll have a situation where those branches will split off. So the structure or the form of the tree is very important when we're looking at the long-term viability of a tree. And of course, these last couple of things are hazards or targets. And that's a pretty standard word to be using, and I hate to say target, but it is a term that we use because it's appropriate. If the tree is in a green belt that doesn't have a trail near it, there's very few targets. That if there was a failure of a branch or a failure of the tree, what would be injured? What would be impacted? As we move closer to those things that we own and that we occupy, the targets increase. How long are the targets there? How frequent is it? And those are the things we look at, again, when looking at possible hazards that are associated with each tree. Diving into the root system a little bit, the regulations protect trees, as we talked about earlier, that have trunks that are 60 inches around and larger. The rules or the guide that protects those trees really focuses on the part of the tree that you don't see. We all can appreciate a beautiful canopy and what it does for us aesthetically. However, the root system can't be ignored. And that's really what we focus on in the development portion of our review and inspection of trees that may be getting impacted. And the root system to trees are just below the surface. And there's many reasons why. First of all, it's a special niche. It's a special location for these roots. They're there because of the moisture content. They're there because of the air allocation that's available to their fine feeder roots. So they don't have to go very deep. As a matter of fact, the deeper you go, the less likely you will find air or that you will find moisture. So they have evolved by just spreading out this network of roots just below the surface. These roots have been exposed likely because of erosion. It was on a slope. But the root system in Austin, for most trees, are right below the surface. And I say that too, especially if you own a shovel and you go out and try to dig on the west side of town. You know you can't get very far without hitting rock. Well, that fertile soil there is right along the top of that very compressed area, and the tree root system is taking advantage of that soil that's there as well. So the guidelines or the recipes that are behind the ordinance really is divided into three different sections. As we assess potential impacts to our largest trees, we start to look at impacts what we call the critical root zone of a tree. And I will just give you a brief example using what's on the board. If this tree has a trunk that's 20 inches in diameter, and again, that's a tree you could barely put your arms around, it has a critical root zone of 20 feet. So roughly from here to the wall is the critical root zone of a tree that has a trunk that's 20 inches in diameter. If there's any work that's being proposed in that area, we want to know because we want to make sure that we're not going to impact this protected tree. And if we are, how much? So that really triggers the permitting process. Are you impacting the critical root zone of this tree? So we start looking even closer. Everything is really permissible up until the halfway point, and what we call the half critical root zone. In the example I mentioned earlier, this would be 10 feet from a tree. At 10 feet, we'd like to pretty much eliminate all impacts. Because if you sever a root, if you impact a root, and that's just below the surface, you've really removed a root that's extremely long. We're just 10 feet from the tree. Biologically, the critical root zone is much larger than what the regulation recognizes as the critical root zone. The biological root zone would be off of the screen. It would be outside of these walls of this auditorium. It's typically 3 times the size of the critical root zone. Again, that tree is trying to acclimate, so it's growing in all different directions, looking for soil, looking for moisture, looking for air. And it doesn't have to be just under the canopy. It could be in multiple directions. But from a simplistic standpoint, we draw these circles around a tree in plan view showing these concentric areas. So at 10 feet, we try to eliminate all impacts. We do allow some nominal impacts within this third zone, or the quarter critical root zone, which should be 5 feet. So between 10 and 5, we would allow things such as a sidewalk or maybe a pier that would simply just pierce the ground that would hold up a foundation or a porch. So as we get closer, and there's benefits of getting closer from a personal standpoint, but we have the potential to impact it greater. So we only permit fewer things the closer you get to each tree. So getting involved early is critical. As you consider or ponder purchasing property, as you start developing conceptual plans of how that would look like, as you assist your clients, as you work with your neighbors or your children, as they embark on developing plans, I think it's very important to recognize trees early, calling out those trees that are extremely valuable that need to be associated with those conceptual plans. As you work with design professionals such as landscape architects and engineers and architects and arborists, it's important to identify that those trees are important to you and how you want those trees you want to maximize the benefits of those trees by incorporating them in the design. And as we do that is planning and recognizing those trees early on. As those plans come to fruition, we start to look in greater detail. Those conceptual plans start to materialize into much more technical approaches. We need to have greater oversight of how those utility lines are going to run, where all those required parking spaces are going to occur. Whatever it may be within that critical root zone, those are the things we need to continue to look at closer and closer. Once construction starts, it's very important to protect those zones. And I've got a slide here to show that. But it's very important to protect those critical root zones because, once again, we are going to impact the biological root zone of those trees that we're incorporating. It's critical that we're preserving at least the regulatory root zones so that tree is sustainable and can quite possibly outlive the development itself, the buildings that we are erecting. And, of course, we use mulch and plywood to protect the root zones and fencing so that there's not an accident at the site with a subcontractor. We clearly demarcate the root protection zone. And I think it's very important, too, to also provide supplemental watering to those trees during development because we are stressing the tree by severing roots outside of that regulatory root zone. And so we want to try to minimize the watering, the stress on those trees by providing supplemental watering in times of no rainfall. So it's not always perfect. The reality is many people are not aware of the tree ordinance. I will say that being in the regulatory world, I'm thankful that so many people are aware. So many people do appreciate trees because we do have incidences where we've had trees that were removed either by ignorance or for other reasons. And it is very difficult to rectify those types of situations. We have penalties, we have court appearances, we have mitigation, but really to mitigate the benefit of a large tree or multiple large trees that have been removed really requires multiple decades to buy that time that we've canceled by a large tree being removed illegally, and for those young trees now to have time to grow. So we do that. We do that again by a team of reviewers at the city. We do that with a team of what I feel is an extended team of the contractor. The contractor needs to be on board with the agreement that they have working and living within the city of Austin and protecting trees. and supervising the crews that are building or erecting this at the development. And then, of course, we have a team of inspectors that work for the city that ensure that all of the environmental compliance parameters are being met. So I mentioned earlier, so trees are protected. We have various rules as it pertains to the size of the tree. This is a very simplistic approach, really based on the trunk size alone. This helps identify potential mitigation cost associated with trees if they were permitted to be removed. And it's a standard that we like to use just to make sure that we have a consistent review. And so what you see in front of you is basically 4 different categories. The first line really recognizes trees that are not technically protected. They are trees that are recognized by code that require non-single family home development to survey trees that are 8 to 19 inches in diameter. So starting with a tree that's 8 inches in diameter. We allow the developer to pick and choose on this category, to be able to incorporate the trees where it's feasible. In many cases, these trees can help meet the intent of the tree preservation ordinance by incorporating maybe some smaller trees where it may be harder to, or more difficult to design around larger trees. So we have the discretion, professional discretion, to look at the trees in total across the board and looking how well or how poor we're doing with our initial design. And if those trees are allowed to be removed, they have to be replaced on a 50% level. And from an example, if you remove that 8-inch, if an 8-inch tree is allowed to be removed, you would be required to replace that tree with 4 inches of new trees. So there's a 50% mitigation threshold. At the 19-inch mark, the second layer, second tier here, that's a protected tree. And again, this is the tree that is considered as a preserved tree or a protected tree by code, and it's presumed to be preserved. And of course, we like to prioritize with our largest trees. If we feel that more trees need to be preserved, of course, we'll hone in on our largest trees. If the adequate number of trees have been incorporated within this design and we allow a protected size tree to be removed, there is 100% mitigation for that. So a 20-inch tree that was allowed to be removed would be required to plant 20 inches of new trees. As we move down the chart, we kind of move up in the scale of value. The heritage tree lines start at the third one. If we have a heritage tree that's allowed to be removed, which is a heritage tree is 24 inches and larger in diameter, there is a 300% replacement. So you multiply the diameter times 3 for the required replacement. And the last one is a tree with a trunk that's 30 inches in diameter or larger. If a tree that's proposed to be removed is a heritage species and has a trunk that's 30 inches in diameter, it's not an administrative process. The code requires the applicant to go through a public process of justifying why this heritage tree is being proposed to be removed. What we're finding, we generally find that we preserve nearly 2/3 of the trees on the property that's being developed. We report those numbers on a monthly basis to our Urban Forestry Board. We monitor those numbers as kind of an internal standard that we want to make sure that we are being consistent amongst each development, each part of town. And we also realize that we can't preserve every tree because we have other issues associated with each property. whether it's initiatives by the city to develop a property or whether it's property rights. There are other things in play where we're not able to preserve every tree on the property. Not to mention that all the trees aren't worthy of being preserved because of poor health. In many cases, we also find that we're able to remove the trees that are in poorer condition and preserve the best trees and mitigate for the trees that we're removing. So we have this nice diversity between old, healthy trees and young native trees that we're planting. Again, if trees are allowed to be removed, we plant trees. That's pretty simple idea. Trees come out, trees go in. That's not always the case. There are times we can't plant any more trees. Either the space is small or there's a very high number of replacements, like the photograph I showed you earlier. Many trees were removed. Those trees have to be mitigated for. So we have different areas of importance, different areas that we can address that are all important, that also aid a healthy urban forest. And so outside of planting new trees, we can also preserve natural areas that may be very important to the site. Let's think of a linear area that's maybe close to a drainage area that could be developed, but yet every foot away from that creek is very valuable. So if we preserve that linear branch, that linear portion of the bank, I find that very valuable from a urban forest standpoint because of all the vegetation that's associated with that drainage area or the green belt. A soil care plan. Great opportunity for us to bring care to the existing trees that are on the property. We have, in many cases, these trees may have never received any type of professional care. So bringing in nutrition for these trees, or uncompacting the soil that maybe has historically been compacted because of the use of the property, helping that tree acclimate to that growing environment is really critical. And I always encourage the blending of planting new trees and caring for the trees that we're preserving, because it's a great opportunity, kind of reinvesting back into the trees as we're reinvesting in developing that parcel. I mentioned earlier transplanting. Transplanting, we transplant very large trees and had a fairly decent success rate on that, but transplanting can also be done with smaller trees. Really, the smaller the trees, the more cost-effective it is. And it's much easier to transplant a tree if it's smaller because you can it's more easier to find a new home for a smaller tree. And then lastly, we have a tree fund. We have to expire all of the mitigative options prior to addressing the tree fund or payment into the tree fund. I suspect the tree fund's probably used once out of every 30 or 50 sites. It's not very common because we're reinvesting in the parcel that we're developing. But if all of those things have transpired and we cannot mitigate any further, then we allow the tree fund to receive a payment that's used citywide with urban forest efforts. So tree planting is one of the last items I wanted to mention. It's an essential part of having a healthy urban forest. Obviously, our large trees are extremely valuable today, and we plant trees for our future generations. It feels very good to do that, to plant in whether it's a group effort or with your neighborhood group, with your family, to plant trees in a park or in your own property. But it comes with challenges. There's many species to choose from. I mentioned earlier we have 100 species in Austin. I'm not counting all the ones that you could buy at the retailers. We encourage people to buy and plant native seed stock to diversify no one's going to argue the beauty of a live oak, of a mature live oak tree. But the reality is we have many species that we are overpopulated with. Cedar elm and our live oaks, we stand to benefit our urban forests when we plant species that are native that we don't have as much of. So we encourage a diversification of plantings. And of course, making sure you plant in the right location. I suspect you'll be getting into this with other speakers. But I mentioned earlier the challenges that we have amongst our city departments. These are just a couple of departments that are at work here, whether it's public works or our parks or even city council level, promoting the benefits of trees. But in particular, I want to bring your attention to both the tree in the top center of the picture and the tree on the bottom right. These are trees in our right-of-way. These are trees I used as an example earlier of that really provide an aesthetic benefit. One of the benefits they provide are aesthetics as we're driving or walking down the road. That happens to be in South Congress. The tree, they're the same type of tree. There's one that's planted in the ground and there's one in a box. And I use that as an example, and this is at Marion in South Congress, that trees are always acclimating to their environment. They're they're providing that service for us, and yet both of those trees are in this picture. The tree that's on the far left, or what I've heard or been told of, these are Easter baskets. These are trees that, well, I've heard they're tree coffins as well, because there's a limited amount of soil. The ambient temperature is much different than the soil temperature that's on the trees on the right. Moisture level is different. And so the growing environment is much different, and these trees were planted at the same time. And there's a noticeable difference. These trees these trees were planted 3 or 4 years ago. And there's already a noticeable difference of the trees and how they're acclimating into their growing environment. So as you pass by there, keep an eye on these trees. We try not to plant trees in these above ground containers. In all honesty, we're forced to making a decision to plant a tree or not to plant a tree in many situations. In this situation, and it was determined that it's best to go ahead and put trees in planters because we couldn't put trees in the ground, either one, because of underground infrastructure, or two, overhead infrastructure. So we're constantly looking and making that decision of what's best in each situation. And so we're trying to avoid planting trees in planters, even at the cost of potentially not even have trees at that location. And once again, it's not just one person. It's not one department. It's really all of us that play a role of ensuring that our trees are not only cared for, are appreciated, and really that we spread the importance that the trees bring to our community. And it really starts with all the eyes that are in the room, all those individuals at the city that have a key role at inspecting trees and working around trees. Our city council, our upper management have always been staunch supporters of the benefits that trees bring to our Austin experience. As our family visits us during the holidays, as our visitors during South by Southwest come every year, our mountain laurels, as in queue, just start to put out these purple flowers to welcome them. Every year, these trees are providing these benefits throughout our community. So that's your test today. Really, the test is for you to take home, to share the trees and your knowledge and your passion for trees with those individuals around you. And with that said, I may have a few minutes for a question. 2 minutes? All right. You think I practiced this. Thank you again. I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Kind of one point to your slide of the Chase Bank. Is that a situation where X amount of trees, inches were removed, so the landscape architect is kind of following the rules and replanting by how much inches they had to replace, so they're kind of covering their butt by sticking trees in boxes at the kind of at the trees, ends?
Thank you. So the question was this a mitigation requirement for trees that were removed at this location? So did the city require those trees to be planted in that location? So the short answer is yes, but not because trees were removed. You can see in the background there's a large tree. This was the best tree on the property. The bank welcomed incorporating that into their motor bank driveway. It's a large pecan tree. And so we pushed all the development closer to this corner. But I said the answer was yes, it was mitigation requirements. The city required those trees to be planted because of other initiatives that the city has. We have screening requirements. We have Great Street requirements. We have requirements to plant trees for the benefit of citizens. So those trees were required to be planted, but not for tree removal purposes. Yes, sir. So it typically is trees are required to be native. And again, we try to encourage a diverse native palette, but ultimately it's the applicant's decision. We don't have that type of oversight to insist upon the type of species, with one exception. The council approved a Great Streets master plan. Many of the trees that you experience in the Central Business District are associated with the plan that have previously selected those types of trees. Those are in our public rights-of-way, and those were selected nearly 10 years ago. For example, the cedar elms that line 2nd Street from here to the Convention Center. Yes, sir.
Is it vested for the health of the tree not to allow any competing grass or plants underneath the drip edge of either young or established trees?
Well, the question was, is it best for the tree to, what type of impacts do other vegetation have in the root zone of the tree? And so I would go back to more of the acclimation example that I used earlier. Trees generally, I try to promote a forest floor. What do you experience when you're in the forest? This is what how trees have evolved. And target to have that layer of mulch, limited amount of competition for vegetation. However, we're all different. Many of us want lawns. Many of us want landscaped areas. And so the more managed area, I think the more potential risk we have, whether it be from a mower or a weed trimmer. And so I would try to limit it and strictly encourage a composted, mulched area around the tree. Okay. One more. I'm thinking. Yes, ma'am.
What is the best way, or what way would you recommend to deal with exposed roots that have been exposed by a tree?
So the question was, how do we deal with exposed roots? So I showed you a picture earlier of some roots that were on a slope. Those roots actually have calloused over. If I showed you a close-up of one, you would have guessed I was showing you a branch. So in many ways, that tree is acclimating to this new environment without soil to protect itself. But the specific response to your question is going to pertain to site conditions. Is it something that's going to continually erode because of the slope itself? Is it a severe slope? It would probably take an engineering effort, upgrading it from that area to prevent that, while matting that area to keep soil in place. If it's a gentle slope, I suspect even just mulch. Mulch is actually an erosion control in a relatively flat environment. And mulch breaks down slowly, and that breakdown is biological and helps actually feed the tree in the long term. Thank you for your time and all day. I appreciate it.